Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for students of counselling and psychotherapy. Here are your hosts, Rory Lees-Oakes and Ken Kelly.
Hello, I'm Rory, and with me, as always, is Ken. How are you today, Ken?
I'm exceptionally well. I've really been doing some self-care lately, and this is episode 165 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. We're glad you joined us, and self-care is kind of a theme that runs through today's podcast. We've got 3 different sections. We start off with what we call our student check-in, where we look at what might be happening in counselling training right now, and in that we're going to be looking into self-care in online PD groups. So if your personal development group has moved to an online group, how do you take care of yourself in that? Then we move on to the Counselling Digital Revolution. That's where we recognize that technology is now part of how therapy is delivered and received by our clients. And there we're going to be speaking about safety in online therapy. And then in practice matters, where we dip our toe into what we need to look at as a practicing practitioner. We're going to be looking at the ethics of self-care. So let's start off. Those students, Rory, personal development groups, or PD groups, as they are known, some of them have moved online, and we need to, I guess, think differently of how we take care of ourselves in those groups.
Yes, absolutely. And I'm sure that tutors who are listening to this have thought long and hard before they've run PD groups online. As someone who's run a fair few PD groups in my time, there's so many moving parts and so much to think about when you're working with other people's process. They're sometimes referred to as process groups. And if you're wondering, if you're listening to this, maybe you're doing a level 2 or an introduction, you think, what's a PD group? Well, part of training to be a therapist is to gain insight into self, and also to be able to develop the ability to challenge others and be inquiring of others' processes. And quite clearly, a PD group, or quite straightforwardly, a PD group is where the students usually sit in a circle. It's facilitated by a tutor, and they process what's going on for themselves. They speak about their own processes and how they experience others. It's a unique environment, where an environment you don't get replicated in any other walk of life, I don't think. And it's an opportunity to actually address someone in the group and say, this is how I experience you. This is how I see you. And for that person to think, is that how I am? Or to say, actually, this is what's going on for me. It's not quite therapy, but it's not far from it. And it's a very kind of narrow line to walk, which is why when you take a PD group into an online environment, there's so many things that you need to think about. And certainly if you're a student undertaking a PD group and you sat at home, you may want to think about how you can take care of yourself. You know, what are you going to do right after the PD group finishes? Are you going to go for a walk, little time of reflection? Maybe just take some time to let that process sink in. It's called a process group for a reason. It's because you're working with your own processes. And it may be that you're thinking and processing how the theory you've learned actually maps into your own life. I think that's one of the most powerful changes, arbiters of change in an individual's training in counselling, where they look at the theory and they think, oh gosh, this is what's happening in my life. There's a theory to explain why I feel like I am. And if you're doing this in a facilitated group, in a building, you know, you've got time to decompress. You leave, you may go and get yourself a coffee, you may get in your car and you drive home. When you're doing this in your own home, I really do think that you need to have some kind of little decompression plan. You know, divers who dive deep in waters, they have decompression. So they don't pop their heads out of the water instantly. They have to come up in a stepway until they reach the surface. And I think decompression is a really good term for coming out of a PD group. Certainly if you're at home, have some form of strategy of something that's going to gradually return you back to the life that you're living. And I'm sure that tutors are going to be very thoughtful on this. They're going to have specific contracting. If they're doing PD groups online, they're going to be aware of students who are having particular difficulties. But I'll be honest, it does bring a specific challenge to students' self-care, because you are taking this processing at home, and when, of course, the PD group finishes and the computer switches off, you're on your own.
Yeah, it is. It's I think we've got frogs in the throats today, Rory, jumping all over the place. Me too. I think self-care is vitally important. And PD groups are super powerful. Speak to students that are graduating and leaving their PD group. Speak to students that have graduated, gone into practice and practiced for some years. They will remember back to their PD group. There's so much growth that can happen within a PD group. But a PD group can be a really challenging place as well. And we've certainly seen comments on our Facebook group where students will share frustrations and challenges that come up in PD groups. Such and such said this and that made me feel like that. And if you're interested in being part of that conversation, jump on Facebook, put in Counselling Tutor. That's our group. Come and join tens of thousands of like-minded people and be part of that group and that conversation. But the thing about a PD group is if somebody maybe mentions something, brings something up that kind of stirs an emotion in you, that's where the learning is. It's not about they did this and they did that. It's about I felt this and I felt that. It is personal development group, not other people development group. So it can be a challenging place at the best of times. But I think taking it from an in-person group and maybe being forced to do that digitally, maybe over video software, brings with it its own challenges. It's going to change. And I think I would echo what you've said, Rory, that there needs to be, that change needs to be acknowledged by the group. In a way, that group is not the same group it was. I understand it's the same people, but by moving it online, it will have a different dynamic because a PD group is a living, breathing entity. Having facilitated a good few myself, and Rory, you facilitated a number of them, they really are. The group itself becomes something. It's a living, breathing entity. And when you take that and put it online, it's going to act differently. The group as a whole, I'm talking here. So new contract when working online from a tutor's perspective, really good idea. And acknowledging, saying, you know what, I recognize we're not sat together in a room. This is online. It is different. I can't see the person the full body language of the person sitting in front of me. I can't put my head down and look at the people's shoes, which is pretty common in a PD group, is to kind of look down, bow your head down, look at the shoes. You can't do that anymore. If you think about how we react over video conferencing software like Zoom or whatever you choose to use, we kind of look forward all the time because we feel it's polite to do so. Maybe contracting within your group that it is okay to maybe drop your head down. How does it work if somebody doesn't have a webcam? Do they still feel part of the group? Does it change the group dynamics if you can't see that person? These are things to work with. And the nice thing I think about the challenges that come up within a PD group is they all lead to personal development. Because it's not as it was, does not mean you can't have personal development. The very nature that it changes and brings stuff up for you is great learning within your personal development group, but always with a focus on your self-care. Your self-care, because within a personal development group, as you quite rightly said, Rory, it is not therapy, but it can be therapeutic. You can find yourself bringing stuff. You can feel emotions coming up and being shown within that group. How do you manage that? How do you manage and keep yourself safe within that environment? So that's what we're kind of focusing on here.
Yes, absolutely. And it is a whole new sphere. You know, the online teaching is something, certainly in counselling, that no one would have ever envisaged before we found ourselves in this COVID society, if you like. So I think everybody's finding the way. But I'm sure that tutors are very, very thoughtful of this. I'm sure that when they sit and meet with colleagues, they're very thoughtful of how students may react. And one of the things that you don't get in an online environment that you do get in a face-to-face is the student that hangs back at the end of a PD group. We used to have our PD groups in the last piece of work, mainly because you do the theory, the skills, and then if there's anything building up that came into awareness for a student, they had the decompression. You see, I'll get the decompression the decompression of the PD group to be able to vent that out and to explore it. But occasionally, when most of the students went home, you'd have a student who'd hang back and they'd be a little bit upset or a little bit distressed, and you'd have to take a few moments just to ground them and help them re-engage into the world they're going back to. And I'm sure that within contracting, a lot of tutors will have that built in. So it may be that as part of the contract, a tutor will say, if anybody just needs a word, I'll be around, and I'll be at the end of the group. It has to be thoughtful, and they can just do a quick one-to-one and just check and see if everybody's okay. But I think if I was a tutor nowadays, I would have a whole lot more to think about when conducting any teaching online than I ever had when I was doing it face-to-face in terms of safety and protection.
Yep.
And I think that we're learning as we go. I know that colleagues who teach online are saying that we're literally learning as we go. But I do think that PD groups online, the safety lives in the contract.
Yeah, definitely. And look to your support structure, your network that you have. So Rory has already painted that picture of you come out of what could be quite an emotionally moving PD session, and you can leave with any range of emotions. Pick an emotion, you can be leaving the PD group holding that emotion. Now, the thought of instantly being faced with maybe your family, maybe chores, maybe something that you have to do, it's challenging. So Rory's already spoken about that decompression, and maybe there's an opportunity to explore what your support system looks like. Maybe you have a peer that you're well connected with on your course that you can touch base with and just chat for 5 minutes after the PD session, just to, again, decompress, something to change gear. I mean, at the very least, if you're in a face-to-face college, university, learning center environment and having a PD group, and if it is held at the end of the session, you at least maybe have the travel time that you would have to get back, where you can clear your mind. So many of our students used to say, you know what, when I drive back after our training sessions, I don't listen to the radio because I find that it interrupts my process, and I like to kind of deprocess and kind of change gear, as it were, before I'm back into I'm doing real world, but I'm doing the inverted commas in the air, the real world. And you don't get that online. You kind of instantly close the window, and now the real world is back. How do you make that transition? And we're not here to tell you how to do it. We're here to challenge you to have a think about how you're going to do that for yourself. And I like your suggestion, Rory, of a walk. That my training is, I go to my training, then we have our PD group, and then I have a 15-minute walk. Nobody talk to me, nobody bother me. Kids, don't come near me until I come back from my walk. And that's a decompression. Or maybe you journal. But think about it, because that self-care is so important, and so much comes up from PD work. If you've been in a group, you know that already. Yeah,
and maybe have your social media switched off, because I think it could be quite easy to vent out onto social media, and it might not be terribly useful in the long term. So maybe just be thoughtful of that. And really take care of yourself. I do think that although this is very different and it has its challenges, it does actually reflect the learning that you students need in a world where you may be practicing online, because all training, if you think about it, is meant to replicate what happens in the real world of counselling. And the real world of counselling more predominantly is either a blended practice or an online practice. So even if it feels different and uncomfortable, actually what you're doing is you're equipping yourself for the work that you're going to go into and the world where it's practiced. So, as someone who's sat in many uncomfortable PD groups as a student, I have to say that it equipped me very well for the world that I went into.
Well, there you have it. That is our student check-in. And as we move away from the personal development group, we look at the Counselling Digital Revolution. That is kind of acknowledging that technology is now part of therapy in delivery, in receiving, and indeed training, as we have just covered. And in Counselling Digital Revolution, we're going to look at the safety when working online.
Digital Counselling Revolution.
Well, as I said in a lot of podcasts in this season, safety is really, really essential. And certainly it's brought a whole new dimension to that word when we think of working online. And, in the last section, we talked about PD groups. In this section, we're talking about what happens when you work online and what safety considerations you need to think about. So let's start off by just analysing or just having a little think about how different working online is to working face-to-face. The client comes in to your therapy room. The space is yours. It's your therapy room. Even if you hire it or in an agency, you own the space there as the therapist. The client comes in, the door shuts, the therapy progresses or commences. It's a enclosed, captured space that you can support the client in. On online therapy, almost certainly the client is going to be having therapy in their own home. And in that case, you need to be very, very thoughtful of how to keep the client safe. And I know there's been a number of observations in the Facebook group saying that some of the techniques aren't really what you would think a counsellor would do. But what about being thoughtful of noises in the background? So you're working with a client and you can hear maybe an angry voice or a noise in the background. What would you do in a therapy room if you heard a noise outside in the street? You'd probably acknowledge it and say, "Oh, this sounds like there's something going on out there." But you wouldn't be thinking in terms of safety because they're outside your physical environment. But if you hear an angry voice, maybe you're working with a client on the phone, maybe you're working with them face-to-face online, and you hear an angry voice, how do you react to that? Because if that's coming from their house, what would you do? So part of safety is thinking about, when you're working with a client, about doing a good assessment of their situation and what difficulties they may be facing. That's absolutely essential. And, I will hold my hands up. It's not something we'd usually do in counselling. And I think a lot of voices are saying, well, this isn't what counselling is. But online counselling is completely different. So, having a safe word, I know that a lot of therapists may have, a safe word that the client uses in case someone comes home unexpectedly. They may have put the space to have therapy. They may not be telling their partner, which is fine, or their children, which is fine. And all of a sudden, halfway through a therapy session, partner comes home, he or she comes home early. What do you do in that situation? So I think if that is a concern and the client voices it, again, you have to contract and negotiate it. It's a big part of safety. And I know some therapists who hear a noise in the background and say, is it okay for you to talk? And the client says no. And the contract is, well, we'll speak again next week.
Yeah. And the important words there, and the contract is. And we covered contracting in depth in episode 164 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. If you haven't listened to that episode, do yourself a favor and go and listen to it, because we cover contracting and how different contracting is when working online. And non-maleficence means we do no harm. We have a duty of care to provide. So often we say we provide a safe and secure environment where you can bring what you have to say. I've had that on my own website. But as Rory has just pointed out, they're not in your environment anymore. You do not have control of the environment where the client is receiving their therapy. And as a result of that, it's difficult to hold that safety. It's not impossible, and we need to contract around it. We need to assess around that to understand what the client's situation may be. And we also need to educate the client in order for them to stay safe. Within your confined space of your therapy room in face-to-face therapy, you've taken care of confidentiality. You've made sure that nobody can see in the window to see who's being counseled. You've made sure that the room is adequately soundproofed, that you can't be overheard from outside. We cannot presume that the client will be in a soundproofed environment that can't be overheard from a different room. And it's about educating and having that discussion before therapy starts, explaining you may be overheard from a different room. You need a safe space you can work. Educating them in terms of technology they can use to minimize that, such as wearing headphones that have got a built-in microphone where they don't have to speak so loudly and there's no sound coming out of the speakers of their system that may be overheard from another room. Or, as you pointed out, Rory, somebody may be unexpectedly arriving home early. About having in your contract what you would do if a commotion did start in the background. What would you do if an argument suddenly broke out? You heard somebody come in the background, suddenly there was an argument and the connection was lost. What do you do as a therapist? That is the client at risk? And this is all dealt with before therapy starts. How you work.
Absolutely. And there's a few little kind of idiosyncrasies that you might not think about with online therapy. So, for instance, if you're using a computer, as we are today, computers have a tendency to have what's called a volume gain, an automatic volume gain. We have ours switched off because we don't want any noises outside to come into the podcast, so we turn ours off. But what can happen is if you're working, say, in your home and working online, and then someone walked past shouting, it might feel to the client like that person was in your room. And again, that could be, well, is there someone else in the room? So I think that, if you are working online and you can hear, you can actually, there's noises outside, is to articulate and say, oh, that's just something outside of the room. Because it can be quite easy for clients, certainly if you're doing telephone work, not to know where you are, that you're a voice on the phone. So I think, being aware of noises or voices that might just be outside. If you're, I'd say, sat in your home and someone walks past speaking loudly, to just say, oh, it's okay, that is actually someone outside. They're not in, it's not in the room. It's okay, because safety goes two ways. I mean, if you're a client and you can hear someone talking in your therapist's room, you think, well, who else is in there?
Yep.
And you've really got to think this through. And unfortunately, modern technology is so good that the microphones will pick up noises as loud as the person who's speaking. So as Ken said, get yourself a headset, and that's super useful. I think a headset's absolutely essential because the mic's near your mouth, you've got the earphones in, and you can really hear the client, and there's less distractions. Yeah. All adds to safety.
It does, and it's educating the client. It's a correct contracting assessment, correct education, giving the client the information they need. And it's tricky. We've mentioned this before. It's so tricky. There's things that you don't even consider. For example, what about the Alexa that sat in the room? What about the Siri that sat in the room? These are listening devices. They're on and listening all the time. Now, as a therapist, if you've done a course on online and telephone counseling, you're not going to have one of those devices anywhere in your room because it is a listening device. It is a microphone that is collecting data. We know this all the time. So that is a direct breach of confidentiality, potentially. We don't know how that the data is used, and I'm not insinuating it is used, but we don't know. And the same, we need to be educating our clients as well. don't have your session in a room where you've got an Alexa or a Siri. You don't want a big microphone that's connected to a company that may be collecting your data when you are sharing your innermost turmoil or whatever you're going through. It is tricky. And again, it's training. Do the adequate training.
Absolutely. And to help you with this, I produced a handout. Sometimes Ken refers to it as a super duper handout.
A super duper duper handout.
Super duper duper handout. Just with some points to think about if you are an online therapist and safety is front of mind, which it should be. And to get that, you go to counsellingtutor.com, go to the podcast tab on the website, look at podcast 165, and that handout is ready for you to download. Safety considerations in online therapy. So important and really has to be front of mind.
Indeed. And if you are considering training in online and telephone therapy, Counselling Tutor have a course, a certificate in online and telephone counselling. I can share with you that we have over 1,000 reviews from peers who have completed this course that you can kind of go and look at and see how they found the course. The course has been awarded quality check training recognition by the National Counselling Society, and Counselling Tutor is a recognised ACTO training provider as well. And if you want more information on that, counsellingtutor.com has the information on how to join our online and telephone counselling course. Wow, so much to consider, really, Rory, isn't there? The digital revolution brings with it, I guess, a very, very steep learning curve. It's got its benefits, but it also certainly has its challenges and new considerations. So let's park that, move away as we go into practice matters, where today we're going to be looking at the ethics of self-care.
Practice matters.
Yes, and those of you who've been listening very carefully will probably have detected a theme in this podcast regarding self-care, safety, and generally looking after yourself and your clients, offering the best service for your clients. And, in this part, I want to talk about something that I don't think is often addressed enough, and that is looking after ourselves. And a lot of people are surprised that certainly if you're a member of the BACP, the British Association of Counselling and Psychotherapy, one of the many ethical bodies that oversee good practice in counselling and psychotherapy, that self-care is actually an ethical imperative. To be an ethical practitioner, you have to consider your self-care. And it's actually in the BAC for ethical framework as care of self as a practitioner. And he starts off by saying we will take responsibility for our own well-being as essential to sustain good practice with our clients. And it goes on to saying taking precautions to protect your physical safety, your psychological and physical health, seeking professional support and services as the need arise, and are keeping a healthy balance between our work and other aspects of life. And I think that last statement is one where we could make a start when working online, because working online demands more of us than working face to face. And as Ken and myself can attest to, because when we do the podcast, if we were to meet face to face and do the podcast, there would probably be a lot less to think about than doing it online, because we have the technology to consider. We have any slight delays that we need to consider. We're working with computer screens. We're working predominantly on our own. And that sometimes has to be acknowledged, and it should be acknowledged if you're a therapist. And in fact, speaking to online therapists, they sometimes limit the amount of clients they have. I was speaking to one of my colleagues, and she was saying that where she'd usually have clients back to back, she has a 15 or 20 minute break between clients when working online, because it is so demanding. Managing the technology, seeing someone online actually is harder work. So we need to be thoughtful about that. And I would suggest that if you are an online practitioner, that you really think about that and just reflect. Is it more demanding than working face to face? And if it is, what you're going to put in place to look after yourself.
Yeah, it's certainly differently demanding. And it's like many things. You need to kind of get fit, and working online is one of those things. And Rory and myself, we spend a lot of time online. We run a Counselling Tutor is an online driven business, so we spend most of our time online, and we become online fit. Eventually the technology vanishes, becomes less cumbersome, but even so, I mean, this morning, as we record our podcast in the morning, and this morning setting it up, it was, hold on, let me just get the technology right, let me just click this, let me just push on that. It's very, very different. One of the things that is maybe not known is that of screen fatigue. So just by sitting in front of a screen, the quality of the light that radiates out from a screen causes fatigue. It wears us down. We have to consider that self-care. And even if you're not working online, because maybe some of our colleagues are still managing to do some face-to-face hours, we need to also look at the kind of situation. We're speaking at the moment during the pandemic, lockdown across many places in the world. It's been tightened and loosened as we speak, and it's different news every day. Things are changing every day. How are we taking care of ourselves during this time? Because we're human, and we're being pulled and pushed in many different directions. It's so challenging. And of course, a great way of taking care of self is to journal. And students on counselling courses are required to journal. In fact, journals are sometimes required as part of the evidence to kind of demonstrate self-development during the process. But journaling is a very cathartic, I guess, process where you can kind of pour out information. Very often, as you know, as counsellors, we can't speak about our jobs. We can't finish our day's work and then go to our family and say, oh, I had a terrible day at work. This person said that, and that person said this, and this is what happened. We can't speak about it because we're holding confidentiality. We can maybe take that to our supervisor, but maybe that is once a month or once so often. So how do you deal with that at a time that is kind of challenging anyway, where you may be kind of working in a different medium, adding additional challenges to that, maybe having to go online. There's a lot going on. There really is a lot going on. And I recognize that, both Rory and myself recognize that many colleagues at the moment, including myself, Rory, not that long ago, I was feeling the stresses and I needed to step back for a little while. That self-care is as important as it's ever been. Maybe we need to just take a moment to refocus on that and think about what we have in our kind of self-care lineup. Are we doing any meditation, mindfulness, yoga, going for walks, a little bit of exercise? Are we sleeping okay? Just looking after us, because if we're not there, the therapy stops. We need to be there, and we need to be okay to be there for our clients.
Absolutely. And this is a really demanding business, if you like. We get we meet clients with very difficult lives, difficult presentations, hear very difficult things. So it's super essential that we look after ourselves and practice self-care, and it is an ethical imperative. And there's no better way to do that than, of course, supervision, or, as I found recently, my own personal therapy. I recently went back to my own personal therapy, and I found that incredibly beneficial, just to kind of explore aspects of my life during a transition period, in terms of COVID. So really, really do take care of yourself. And what an episode we start. Self-care has been a theme of this episode. We started off with self-care in online PD. Then we talked about safety in online therapy, and now we finished on the ethics of self-care. So as always, if you're in the digital revolution, please stay grounded and stay safe.
Take the stress out of your counselling studies and get the support of Rory and I by joining us in the Counselling Study Resource. Counselling Study Resource, or CSR for short, is the world's most comprehensive assignment guidance and study support resource for students just like you of counselling and psychotherapy. See how Counselling Study Resource can help you. Visit counsellingtutor.com. counsellingtutor.com. That's counsellingtutor.com.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Find the show notes for this episode on our website at www.counsellingtutor.com.